65 candles would have been too many to light, so I didn't bother with even one. Instead, I sat alone in my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock, the only sounds marking my birthday. The cake I'd picked up from the store, a small one, iced in plain white with no writing, sat untouched on the counter. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss a story like this one. I had thought foolishly, perhaps, that this day might feel different. Retirement was behind me now, my years of labor paid for with stiff hands and a worn-out back. 65 was a number my younger self never thought he'd see, and yet here I was, breathing, upright, carrying the weight of it all. I thought maybe my family would remember that too. But the phone sat silent. No call from my daughter, no visit from my son-in-law, no laughter of my grandson spilling through the door. Just silence, thick, heavy silence that pressed into the corners of the house like fog. It wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, birthdays had meant a crowded table, balloons taped to the walls, my late wife fussing over the details until everything looked just so. My daughter had been the one to insist on candles even when money was tight. "It's not a birthday without them, Dad," she would say, grinning as she shoved matches into my hand. I could still see her, 10 years old, standing on a chair to help blow them out, her hair tangled from the summer breeze. But now, she had grown into someone else, someone who saw me less as a father and more as a relic, a man whose usefulness had run its course. That morning, instead of a call, a text had come. Short, cold, final. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." I stared at it until the words blurred. It wasn't the first sharp message I'd received, but it was the finality of it that stung. As if my presence in her life was a burden too heavy to carry. As if the decades of sacrifice, the nights working double shifts to cover tuition, the weekends spent helping with house repairs, the checks quietly written when bills came due, none of it had ever mattered. I set the phone down, the glow of the screen fading into black. My reflection looked back at me, lined face, tired eyes, a man whose own daughter had written him out of her life with 12 words. My son-in-law had liked the message. That was the part that cut deepest. A little green bubble of approval, casual and smug, as though the humiliation of being shut out of my own family was something to applaud. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in on me. I pushed back from the table, pacing to the window. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, neighbors carried groceries, a dog barked in the distance. Life continued, indifferent to the ache hollowing me out from the inside. I thought of my wife then, how she used to tell me that love without respect eventually curdles into something unrecognizable. She had warned me gently about the ways our daughter leaned too heavily on what we provided. "One day," she had said, "you'll have to let her stand on her own." I hadn't listened. I thought love meant stepping in every time, no matter the cost. And maybe that was my mistake. I sat back down, staring again at the untouched cake. The silence was deafening. For a long time, I did nothing but breathe. But somewhere in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't rage, though anger simmered low. It wasn't despair, though grief had been my shadow for years. It was resolve, a quiet, steady flame that began to rise. If they wanted space, they would have it. If they thought I was irrelevant, they would learn what irrelevance truly meant. The difference would be this. When I stepped back, I wouldn't just disappear. I would take with me everything they had come to assume was theirs. Every safety net, every unspoken guarantee, every dollar of a future they thought was already written. For the first time in years, I blew out an unlit candle just to feel the release of it. And I whispered into the empty room, "So be it." The next morning came with a thin gray light that slipped through the blinds. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same cake still untouched, the text still on my phone screen. I hadn't deleted it. I couldn't. It sat there like a bruise, small but impossible to ignore. I poured myself coffee, the steam curling into the cold air, and for a long time I just stared at it. My mind didn't stay in the present. It wandered backward to the years when life was loud and messy, when this house had been full of voices instead of silence. I thought of the nights when I would drag myself home after double shifts. Steel-toed boots heavy, back aching, lungs raw from dust and smoke. My daughter would already be asleep by then, curled in her bed with a worn-out stuffed animal tucked against her side. My wife would sit at the kitchen table waiting for me, 2 mugs of tea growing cold as we talked in whispers about bills, about groceries, about how to stretch what little we had. It was never easy, but it was ours. Every milestone of my daughter's life had been carved out of those sacrifices. The braces when insurance wouldn't cover them. The piano lessons she insisted she wanted, even though she quit a year later. The tuition checks that drained what little retirement savings I had. I told myself each time that it was worth it, that giving her more than I had was what being a father meant. And then there was the wedding. I remembered standing in that rented hall, my tie too tight, my wallet already emptied by the dress, the flowers, the band. My wife had leaned on my arm, her smile wide despite her own exhaustion. My daughter had looked radiant, glowing, but when the speeches came, not once did she thank us. Her husband had toasted his family, his friends, his incredible luck, but my wife and I were invisible in the room we had paid for. That night, as we loaded leftover trays into the back of my truck, my wife had squeezed my hand. "It's all right," she whispered. "We didn't do it for the thanks." I believed her. I still do, but the silence stung. After my wife passed, the silence grew louder. It was my daughter who had filled it, at least at first. She called often then, asking if I was eating, if I was managing the house. But it didn't take long before the questions turned into requests. A few hundred for car trouble, a little more for rent, then more for a trip. Just this once, I gave and gave, telling myself that this was love, that helping her was how I could honor the woman I had lost. But love had turned into something else. It had turned into expectation. Somewhere along the way, my daughter had stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a bank. My son-in-law had only encouraged it, his smugness growing each time he held out his hand. They dressed better than I ever had. They ate at restaurants I couldn't pronounce. They took vacations while I worked overtime just to cover their debts. And still I said nothing. Because love, I told myself, doesn't keep score. But as I sat there staring at that text on my phone, I realized I had been wrong. Love doesn't keep score, but respect does. And without respect, love rots into something bitter. The clock ticked on the wall, steady as always, but it no longer sounded like time passing. It sounded like a reminder. A reminder that my years were shorter than they were long, that the time I had left couldn't be wasted on people who saw me only as a resource. I thought of my wife again, her laugh, her gentle warnings, her way of making me see the truth even when I didn't want to. I could almost hear her voice. "You've done enough. It's time to let go." I picked up the fork from the counter, cut a small piece of the cake, and ate it slowly. It was dry, overly sweet, not at all like the cakes my wife used to bake. But it wasn't about the taste. It was about the act. I would celebrate myself even if no one else did. And in that act, I felt the faintest stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not anger. Resolve. The house was too quiet that night, not the peaceful quiet that used to follow when my wife and I would tuck our daughter into bed and sit together on the porch, listening to crickets hum under the summer stars. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that pressed in heavy and suffocating, like the silence of a church after the mourners have gone home. I sat in my chair by the window, the phone still lying face up on the table. That message glowed against the dark. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." The words were final, almost clinical, as if they'd been drafted by a lawyer instead of my own flesh and blood. I had read it 100 times. Each time it stripped away another layer of memory. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee I had kissed better, every mile I drove to pick her up from school events, all of it crumbled under those 12 words. And the cruelest part, the little green like from my son-in-law beneath it, as though to punctuate the dismissal. I pressed the phone screen until it went black. I couldn't look at it anymore. The clock ticked steadily behind me, and in that rhythm I felt something begin to shift, a kind of clarity. My wife had once told me, kindness is a gift, but if it's taken for weakness, it becomes a chain. I hadn't understood her then. I thought you could never give too much, never love too hard, never sacrifice too deeply. But sitting there, staring into the emptiness of my own house, I finally understood. For years, I had confused love with obligation. I had convinced myself that silence in the face of disrespect was grace, that giving without thanks was generosity. But all it had done was feed a hunger that could never be satisfied. The text was not just a dismissal. It was proof that they no longer saw me as a father, as a man, as a human being. To them, I was only a wallet with thinning patience. My chest tightened, not with sorrow this time, but with resolve. If they wanted space, I would give them space. Not just in words, but in the only language they seemed to understand. Action. I rose from the chair, the weight of 65 years in my bones, and walked to the desk where my papers were kept. Old files, bills, tax returns, letters from my wife. The clutter of a life lived quietly. But buried there too were folders more important than the rest. Bank statements, deeds, retirement accounts, the blueprint of everything I had built. I laid them out one by one, the paper cool under my fingers, the house, the savings, the trust I had begun to form years ago, back when I still believed my daughter would take care of me in my old age. Each document was a reminder. I was not powerless. My silence had not been weakness. My sacrifices had not been small. And now those sacrifices would no longer be theirs to squander. I picked up the phone again, but this time I didn't scroll through messages or wait for a call that would never come. Instead, I dialed a number I hadn't used in months. "Foster and Crane, attorneys," came the voice on the other end. "This is Wayne," I said, my voice low but steady. "I need an appointment, tomorrow if possible." The receptionist asked for details, but I kept it short. "It's about my estate. Some things need to change." When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't in years. Control. For so long I had let others decide my worth, my role, my relevance. But now I would write my own ending. The phone buzzed again that night. A call this time. My daughter's name lit the screen. I let it ring until it went silent, then again and again. Eventually her voice filled the voicemail box. At first it was anger. "How dare you ignore me after everything?" Then it softened into manipulation. "Dad, we just need space, but we still love you." By the third message, it was desperation. "Please don't do anything rash. We can talk. We'll work it out." I sat in my chair, listening to the messages pile up. I didn't answer. Not one word. Because silence was no longer my weakness. It was my weapon. The morning of the appointment, the sky was low and heavy with clouds. I dressed slower than usual, my hands stiff with the cold, my reflection staring back at me from the mirror above the sink. I saw the lines around my eyes, the graying hair, the tiredness that years of sacrifice had etched into me. But I also saw something else, a steadiness. When I pulled into the parking lot of Foster and Crane, the wind rattled the bare branches overhead. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the wheel, letting the weight of the decision settle over me. This wasn't just about money, it was about dignity, about drawing a line where none had existed before. Inside, the office was warm, the scent of coffee and old books heavy in the air. I was greeted by David Foster himself, a man I had worked with years earlier when I set up a modest trust after my wife's passing. He had been younger then, just starting out. Now his hair was silver at the temples, his presence calm and measured. "Wayne," he said, offering his hand. "It's been a while." "Too long," I admitted, gripping it firmly. "But I'm here because something needs to change." We sat across from each other at a broad oak desk. Papers were already stacked neatly to the side, but he pulled out a yellow legal pad and waited. "Tell me what's happened," he said. I took a breath and told him everything. The text from my daughter, the smug approval from my son-in-law, the silence on my birthday, the years of sacrifice, the endless giving, the slow erosion of respect. I spoke steadily without embellishment. Each word felt like a stone laid on the table between us. When I finished, the room was quiet. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with a measured expression. "You've carried more than your share," he said finally. "And now you're ready to shift the weight." I nodded. "I don't want them to live off what I've built. Not anymore. Not after this. If they want space, I'll give them space, but they won't take my legacy with them." He opened a file. "Then we'll start by removing them as beneficiaries. We'll redirect your estate. You'll need to decide where it goes instead." I thought about that. For years I had assumed everything would flow naturally to my daughter, that she would safeguard what I left behind, carry forward the values her mother and I tried to instill. But now, that trust had been shattered. "There are options," David continued. "Charities, scholarships, community programs, or if you want to keep it in the family, we can establish a trust for your grandson, controlled by you until he comes of age." At the mention of him, something tightened in my chest. My grandson, innocent, unknowing, caught in the crossfire of greed he hadn't chosen. He didn't deserve to pay the price for his parents' arrogance. "I want him protected," I said firmly. "Not them, just him." David nodded, jotting down notes. "We can structure it that way. The funds bypass your daughter and her husband entirely. You'll control how and when your grandson benefits." I leaned back, the weight of it settling over me. For the first time since that text arrived, I felt something solid under my feet. David slid a stack of documents toward me. "There's more. Credit lines. Accounts they've been authorized to use. You can revoke those effective immediately. They'll find out soon enough when the cards stop working." A grim satisfaction flickered through me. For years I had enabled their illusion of wealth. Every dinner they boasted about, every trip they flaunted, every photo they posted, it had all been built on my back. Let them feel the floor drop out. Let them see what life looked like without my silent support. As I signed each page, the pen scratching steadily against the paper, I felt lighter. Not free yet, but lighter. By the time I placed the pen down, David gathered the papers neatly. "It's done," he said. "The changes will take effect within days." I stood slowly, gripping the edge of the desk for balance. "Thank you." He gave me a long look. "You're not just cutting them off, Wayne, you're reclaiming yourself. Don't forget that." I left the office with the wind cold against my face, but inside a strange warmth had begun to grow. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was strength. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I wasn't bending under the weight of endless requests. I was standing on my own. And as I drove home, the clouds broke just enough to let a sliver of light cut through. It felt like a sign. The first sign came faster than I expected. 2 days after I signed the papers at David Foster's office, my phone buzzed with a string of missed calls. I didn't answer. The voicemails followed, clipped, hurried, increasingly panicked. At first, my daughter's voice carried a sharp edge. "Dad, what's going on? The card got declined at the store today. You need to fix this. We were in line with groceries, for God's sake." People were staring. The second message was colder, tinged with her husband's smugness. "We're not sure what you've done, but if this is your idea of a joke, it's not funny. We've got bills to pay. Fix it." By the third message, the sharpness had dulled into a pleading note. "Dad, please, just call us back. We can talk about this. Don't leave us hanging like this." I sat in my chair, listening to each one, the weight of years pressing against me. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. This was what silence sounded like when it was finally mine. At the grocery store the next morning, I overheard whispers at the checkout line. My daughter had been there the day before trying to pay for a cart full of items. The card declined 3 times, the cashier apologizing each time while the line behind her grew restless. Finally, she had stormed out, leaving the bags behind. I pictured her face, flushed, angry, humiliated, and though part of me ached, another part whispered, she needed this. My son-in-law's humiliation came later that week. I was in the hardware store picking up screws and sandpaper when 2 men at the counter laughed quietly. "Did you see him? Marched into the dealership like he owned the place, tried to drive off in a new SUV. Card wouldn't clear. He left cussing up a storm, everyone watching." I kept my head down, paid for my items, and walked out without a word. But inside I felt something stir. Not triumph, not revenge, but a measure of balance. For too long the scales had been uneven, now they were tipping. The real shift came when the landlord called. Not mine, but theirs. I had co-signed years ago, back when they begged for a bigger place, saying the baby needed a yard to play in. My name had carried the weight their credit couldn't. The landlord's voice was polite but firm. "Mr. Walker, just letting you know the lease will be terminated unless payment is made. They're 3 weeks behind. Since your authorization has been revoked, I assume this is intentional?" "Yes," I said simply. "It's intentional." There was a pause, then a quiet, "I see." When the call ended, I sat for a long time in the silence. My grandson's face flashed through my mind. Innocent, trusting, unaware of the storm brewing around him. It wasn't his fault. It never had been. But his parents needed to feel the weight of their choices, or nothing would ever change. That evening, as the sun set over the yard, I walked to the shed and pulled out the old lawn chair my wife used to sit in. I unfolded it, set it on the porch, and sat watching the horizon. For years I had been too busy to sit like this, too busy bailing them out, fixing what they had broken, answering calls in the middle of the night. But now the phone sat inside, buzzing uselessly on the counter. They were learning what life without my constant hand felt like, and I was learning what peace could feel like. The next day brought another set of voicemails, more desperate this time. My daughter's voice trembled. "Dad, please. The landlord's threatening eviction. We don't know what to do. Just help us one last time. I promise we'll figure things out after this. Just don't turn your back on us." I played it once, then again, then deleted it. It wasn't that I didn't love her, I always had and I always would, but love without boundaries had turned into poison. By nightfall, I sat at the table with a notebook making plans. Not for them, for me, for my grandson, for the legacy my wife and I had built from nothing but grit and sacrifice. I wrote down names of charities, community projects, scholarships, places where money could become more than vanity purchases and vacations, places where it could matter. And as I wrote, I felt something settle inside me. The future no longer belonged to those who treated me as a burden. It belonged to those who would respect it. The house phone rang again that evening, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet like a blade. I sat in my chair watching the light fade from the window, the phone glowing on the table beside me. For years I had answered every ring, no matter the time, no matter the demand, no matter the tone of the voice on the other end. This time I didn't move. The machine clicked on and my daughter's voice spilled into the room, frantic and rushed. "Dad, please, pick up. The landlord's serious this time. He says we're out by the end of the month if we don't pay. I don't know where we'll go. Please just answer, please." The words cracked, splintered with tears. The phone went silent, then rang again. Another voicemail, this one with her husband's voice, angrier, bitter. "You can't just cut us off like this after everything we've done for you, after all the times we've been there. You owe us, do you hear me? You owe us." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my chest and let the words fade into the quiet. Once those accusations might have pierced me, might have left me pacing the room in guilt and shame. But not anymore. They had mistaken my kindness for debt, my sacrifices for obligations, and I was done paying. The days stretched into a rhythm. Each morning I brewed coffee, sat at the table with the newspaper, and listened as the voicemails stacked one after the other. The tone shifted daily, sometimes pleading, sometimes furious, sometimes manipulative. My daughter's voice soft and breaking. "Dad, please, think of your grandson. He needs stability, he needs a home. Don't let him suffer for our mistakes." Then her husband's voice sharp, spitting. "You're pathetic, sitting there with your little pension thinking you're in control. You think anyone respects you? They laugh at you. Without us, you'd have no family at all." I let them all play, then pressed delete. Silence filled the room once more, steady, grounding. At the grocery store, I began to notice the looks. People glanced at me with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Respect, maybe. Whispers carried across aisles. He finally cut them off. About time. He's not bending anymore. The community had seen the charade for years. They had watched as my daughter and her husband paraded luxuries they couldn't afford, never realizing where the money truly came from. Now the truth was spilling into the open, and for once, it wasn't me on trial. One afternoon, as I was stacking wood for the fireplace, a car pulled into the driveway. My heart clenched when I saw who stepped out. My daughter stood there, pale and weary, clutching my grandson's hand. Her husband sat sulking behind the wheel, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "please, can we just talk?" I looked at my grandson first, small, confused, his eyes darting between us. He tugged at her hand, whispering, "Mom, I'm cold." The ache in my chest nearly doubled me over, but I stayed firm. "I told you what I had to say when you sent that text," I said quietly. "You wanted space. This is space." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean it like that. We needed a break. We were overwhelmed." I shook my head. "You said don't reach out anymore. And I'm respecting that." Her husband's voice rang out from the car. "He's enjoying this, can't you see? He's sitting up there smug, punishing us like he's some kind of king." I didn't answer him. I simply turned back toward the shed, my back straight, my silence louder than any words I could have spoken. When I came back out minutes later, the car was gone. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought of my wife again. I imagined her sitting across from me, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady. She would have told me this was right, that sometimes silence speaks louder than all the shouting in the world. And as the fire crackled, warming the room, I realized something. Their unraveling wasn't because of me. It was because without me, the illusion they had built for themselves collapsed under its own weight. All I had done was stop holding it up. The messages came in waves, morning, noon, night. The phone blinked and buzzed with desperate words that spilled into the void. Once I would have answered on the first ring, heart racing, fear gnawing at me that something was wrong. But now I let the machine pick up and I sat back, listening to the voices unravel. My daughter's tone shifted like the tide. At dawn, her voice cracked with sorrow. "Dad, please, we're sorry. We never should have said those things. We were stressed. We weren't thinking straight. Please just call me back." By afternoon, it hardened into a plea wrapped in guilt. "Do you really want your grandson to be homeless? To grow up thinking his grandfather abandoned him? You raised me better than this." And by evening, it soured into something sharp. "This isn't you. You're letting bitterness poison you. You'll regret this when you're alone and gone and no one is there to bury you." I listened to each word, each shift in tone, and pressed delete. Her husband's messages were worse, venom dressed up as authority. "We know what you're doing. You think you're in control, but the law will be on our side. We'll fight this in court, and when we win, you'll have nothing left." Another message came the next day, his voice angrier. "This is elder abuse, don't you know that? You're sick, twisting everything to punish us. People will see what kind of man you really are." But people already saw. And what they saw wasn't what he thought. At the diner that week, Annie poured my coffee and leaned in close. "Saw them the other day. Caused a scene right outside the store, screaming about injustice, how you've ruined their lives." Folks just shook their heads. I sipped my coffee, staring into the steam. "And what did you think?" She smiled sadly. "I think you finally found your backbone. You've carried them long enough." The community whispered, and those whispers grew into something firmer. What once had been a question, "Why does he let them treat him like that?" had turned into a statement. He's done being their doormat. Still, the pressure mounted. One afternoon, as I stacked wood behind the shed, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I wiped my hands on my jeans and turned. Their car sat at the end of the drive, engine idling. My daughter stepped out, her hair pulled back hastily, her eyes red and swollen. She clutched my grandson's hand again, pulling him close as if his presence would soften me. "Dad," she called, her voice breaking. "Please, please just listen." Her husband sat behind the wheel, scowling, tapping his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel. I stayed where I was, the axe still in my hand, the pile of wood between us. "You said you needed space," I said evenly. "I'm giving it to you." Tears streamed down her face. "I didn't mean it. I was angry. We were overwhelmed. You know how hard it is. Please, Dad, just one more chance." Her husband leaned across the passenger seat, shouting, "Don't fall for this, old man. You think you've won something here? You've just made us your enemies, and you'll regret it." The sound of his voice made my grandson flinch. He pressed against his mother's side, eyes wide, clutching her arm. That sight alone nearly broke me. The innocence of a child forced to stand in the storm of adult greed. I looked at him, then back at her. "He deserves better than this," I said softly, "and he'll have it. But not through you." Her face crumpled. She sobbed, pulling him back toward the car. Her husband slammed the gear shift, tires spitting gravel as they roared away, their anger trailing like exhaust in the cold air. I stood there long after they were gone, the axe heavy in my hand, my chest aching. Every instinct as a father screamed at me to step in, to fix things, to protect her from the consequences of her own choices. But I knew If I stepped in now, I'd undo everything. Silence wasn't just my choice anymore. It was the only thing left that could save what mattered. That night I sat by the fire, my grandson's face burned into my memory. His small eyes, the way he'd pressed against his mother, the confusion etched into his features. I knew one day he'd ask questions. Why had I stepped back? Why had I let things fall apart? And when that day came, I would tell him the truth, because silence is not absence. Sometimes silence is love refusing to be used. The knock came at dusk. It wasn't the polite kind of knock a neighbor gives when dropping off mail or returning a tool. It was hard, insistent, echoing through the small house like a summons. I set down my mug of coffee, my hands steady though my pulse quickened. Through the window I could already see the car idling at the end of the drive, its headlights casting long shadows across the gravel. My daughter's figure stood at the porch, shoulders hunched against the cold, while her husband leaned against the car with his arms crossed. I didn't move to open the door, not yet. The knock came again, louder. "Dad!" Her voice cracked through the wood. "Please open the door, we need to talk." I remained still, my eyes fixed on the grain of the wood beneath my hand. For years I had answered every call, every plea, every demand. Now silence was my reply. "Dad!" Her voice trembled. "We're out of time. The landlord, he means it. We have to be out by Friday. Please, you can't just let this happen." Behind her, her husband's voice cut sharp across the yard. "He hears you. He's just playing games. Old man thinks he's won something. He's pathetic." The words stung, but I didn't let them touch me. Words only wound when you let them inside. I stepped back from the door, slow and deliberate. I pulled a chair close to the window instead, where I could see them without being seen. My daughter stood with her fists pressed against the frame, her breath fogging the glass. Her husband paced, muttering curses into the night air. My grandson sat in the back seat of the car, small face pale in the glow of a screen, oblivious or pretending to be. I stayed where I was, silent. Minutes stretched into an hour. The knocking slowed, then stopped. Her voice shifted from pleading to bargaining. "Dad, we'll pay you back, I swear, just a loan, just to get us through. Please, you don't have to cut us off completely. Think of your grandson, think of me." But I had thought of her. For decades I had thought of nothing but her. Every sacrifice I had made, every late shift, every bill covered, every dollar handed over, all of it had been for her. And still it had never been enough. Now my silence was not cruelty. It was clarity. Through the window I saw her finally sink to the step, her hands covering her face. Her husband kept pacing, cursing louder, his voice breaking the night. "We'll take you to court, old man. You think you can erase us? You'll see." I didn't answer. I didn't even flinch. When the porch light flickered on with the timer I'd set weeks ago, they both startled. The glow illuminated them in full view, her weary face streaked with tears, his jaw tight with anger. They looked smaller under that light, not larger. At last he grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the car. She resisted for a moment, glancing back at the door, her lips forming the word "Dad" one last time. I didn't move. The car door slammed, the engine roared, and gravel scattered as they sped back down the drive. When silence returned, I sat there, the house humming softly around me. The boundary had been tested, and it had held. I walked to the door, locked it, and slid the deadbolt into place. Not out of fear, but out of certainty. The walls of this house had held my family once. Laughter, arguments, meals, holidays. But tonight they had held my resolve. I returned to the chair, the fire crackling low, and thought of my wife again. She would have understood. She would have told me that love sometimes means closing the door even when it breaks your heart to do it. And as the night deepened, I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I wasn't answering because I wanted peace. I was answering with silence because I had finally found it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the slot with the rest of the mail. Unlike the usual stack of bills and circulars, this one was heavier, the envelope stiff. The name of Foster and Crane printed in neat block letters across the corner. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. They had finally made their move. I sat at the kitchen table, running a thumb along the crease before tearing it open. Inside was a formal notice, a request for my presence at the office for clarification of estate matters. My daughter and her husband had petitioned for review, convinced, no doubt, that they could argue their way back into what they thought was theirs. For a moment, I just stared at the paper, the words sharp against the white. Once the idea of being dragged into such a confrontation would have tied my stomach in knots. Now I felt something else, not fear, not even dread, readiness. 2 days later, I stepped into the office's tall glass doors. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. David Foster greeted me with the same steady calm as always, guiding me into a conference room where the long oak table stretched under dim light. They were already there. My daughter sat rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but defiant. Her husband leaned back in his chair, his expression dripping with smug confidence. Between them, a folder of papers sat open, their pages fanned out like weapons. The moment I entered, my son-in-law sneered. "Finally. Maybe now we can get some sense into you." My daughter's eyes flickered softer but no less demanding. "Dad, please, this has gone too far. We can fix this if you just listen." I didn't answer. I pulled out a chair and sat, my movements slow, deliberate, the weight of silence already filling the room. David Foster took his seat at the head of the table, adjusting his glasses. "We're here today to address concerns raised by your daughter and her husband regarding your estate planning. They believe they have been unfairly excluded. Is that correct?" Her husband jumped in before she could speak. "Excluded? It's theft. He's senile and someone's clearly manipulating him. He doesn't know what he's doing. We have every right to that estate." David's pen tapped against his notes once before he spoke. "On the contrary, Mr. Walker came to this office of his own free will. The documents were revised in full compliance with state law. All signatures were witnessed. There is no question of manipulation." My daughter leaned forward, her voice trembling. "But it's not fair. He's my father. That money is supposed to be ours. He raised me. It's natural. He can't just cut me out." I looked at her then, long and steady. "I didn't cut you out of my life. You did that yourself. I only made sure you wouldn't cut me out of my legacy." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her husband slammed a fist against the table. "This is ridiculous. We'll sue. We'll drag this through court and you'll regret humiliating us like this." David's tone sharpened. "You are free to attempt legal action, but I assure you the courts will uphold what's written here. The estate has been redirected into a trust. Your father is the sole trustee until his grandson comes of age. You have no control, no access, and no authority." Silence fell heavy across the table. My daughter's face drained of color, her eyes darting between the lawyer and me. Her husband leaned back, sputtering, his bluster faltering under the weight of the words. David continued, his voice calm but final. "The stipend you've been receiving has already been revoked. All accounts tied to your names are closed. Going forward, only the grandson benefits, and only under his grandfather's oversight. That is the reality." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading into every corner of the room. My daughter pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. For a moment I thought I heard the girl she once was. The child who used to climb into my lap and beg for one more story before bed. But when she lowered her hands, it wasn't that child anymore. It was a woman who had mistaken love for a free ride and who now faced the weight of her own choices. Her husband rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think you've won? You'll see what happens when we're through with you." He stormed out of the room, the door slamming so hard the glass trembled. My daughter sat still, silent for once. Her eyes met mine across the table, full of something I couldn't name. Not apology, not yet. But perhaps the first crack in her certainty. I stood tucking the folder of documents under my arm. My voice was steady as I spoke. "This was never about money. It was about respect, and you lost that long before today." As I left the room, David Foster's voice followed, calm and firm. "The matter is settled." And for the first time in years, I felt like something inside me was settled too. The air in the conference room felt heavier after my son-in-law stormed out, the echo of the door still reverberating through the walls. My daughter sat slumped in her chair, her hands limp in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. David Foster cleared his throat gently, drawing her attention back. He adjusted his glasses, his tone calm but firm. "For the record, the revisions to the estate are not merely a matter of exclusion. Your father has restructured the assets in a way that ensures their longevity and impact. You should understand what that means." Her eyes flickered with confusion. "Impact? What are you talking about? It's supposed to be ours. My husband and I—" David interrupted smoothly. "It is not yours. It is your son's, and even then only under your father's stewardship until he comes of age. And beyond that, the estate has been tied to specific purposes." She blinked, the words settling like stones in her mind. "Purposes?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I've seen what happens when money is treated like air. Something you breathe in without thought, without gratitude. It suffocates character. I won't let that happen to him, or to the legacy your mother and I built with our hands." David nodded, sliding a packet of papers across the table. "The estate is now twofold. One portion is placed in a trust solely for the grandson's needs. Education, health, stability. It cannot be touched for vanity, for travel, or for luxuries. It is locked to his well-being, and your father alone manages it until he is old enough." My daughter's lips trembled. "And the rest?" David tapped the packet with his pen. "The rest has been dedicated to something symbolic. A scholarship in your late mother's name, funding education for children from families who never had the help you were given. The same field your father once sacrificed to send you into. That money will not vanish into restaurants and handbags. It will change lives." Her face went pale, her breath quickening. You gave it away?" I met her eyes. "I redirected it. To honor your mother. To honor the work we both did to keep this family afloat when every dollar mattered. You think money is power, but it isn't. It's responsibility. And you abandoned that responsibility long before today." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she pressed a hand to her mouth. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, that she might finally understand. But the words that left her lips were different. "You had no right," she whispered. "It was ours. It was always supposed to be ours." I shook my head slowly. "It was never yours. It was mine and your mother's, and now it's his, and it's theirs." I tapped the papers, the lines detailing the scholarship, the trust, the safeguards. "The children who will study, the families who will breathe a little easier, that is where the legacy goes. Not into the bottomless pit of your wants." David gathered the papers neatly. "The court recognizes the revisions as binding and final. Contesting them would not only fail, but it would also risk what little stipend remains available. I advise you to consider carefully." Her shoulders shook, her sobs breaking the last of the composure she clung to. She buried her face in her hands, her body folding inward. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had dismissed me, not as the entitled adult who had drained my years, but as the child I once carried, lost, afraid, angry. But even then I knew, love is not the same as enabling. I stood, sliding the chair back quietly. My voice was low, but it carried. "This is the legacy your mother and I built, one of work, of sacrifice, of love that never asked for thanks. You could have shared in it if respect had been part of your love. But now, it belongs to those who will respect it." She didn't look up, not as I turned, not as I walked out of the room, not as David closed the door gently behind us. In the hallway, I paused, leaning against the cool wall. My chest ached, not with regret, but with the sharp weight of finality. For years, I had imagined this confrontation would break me. But standing there, I felt something else instead. Relief. Because for the first time, the future wasn't in greedy hands. It was secure. The weeks after the meeting unfolded like a slow storm. Not the kind that tears through suddenly with lightning and thunder, but the kind that builds quietly on the horizon, rolling closer until the whole sky changes color. My daughter and her husband had always lived loudly, posting photos of dinners at restaurants, vacations to places most folks in our town had never seen, gifts wrapped in glossy paper piled high at Christmas. Their lives had been curated like a stage show, every detail polished for display. Now the curtain was coming down. At the diner, I overheard the whispers first. She was at the grocery store again. Tried 3 different cards, all declined. Walked out red-faced, left the cart full behind. "Did you hear about him? Tried to borrow from one of the contractors downtown, got laughed out the door. No one wants to lend to a man with nothing to... His name." I kept my head down, stirring my coffee, letting the whispers pass. They didn't know I had heard them. And even if they did, I had nothing to add. But the whispers grew louder. One afternoon, walking down Main Street, I saw them myself. My daughter stood outside the bank, her arms folded tight, her face pale. Her husband was beside her, his voice sharp as he argued with the teller inside. His hands cut the air angrily, his face flushed, while she looked around nervously, catching the stares of neighbors passing by. She caught my eye for a split second. Her lips parted as if she might call out, but I turned and kept walking. My silence was answer enough. At church the following Sunday, the pastor's sermon seemed to bend with the wind of truth. When wealth becomes a god, it destroys what it was meant to build. When love becomes entitlement, it eats away at family. But when sacrifice is honored, it multiplies into blessings for generations. Heads nodded in the pews. I sat quietly, hands folded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like confirmation. And still the messages came. The phone blinked day and night. Some were angry. "You've ruined us. You'll regret this when you're alone in a nursing home begging for help." Others were pleading, "Dad, please, just this once. We'll change. We'll do better." But I had learned something. Words are only as strong as the actions behind them, and I had seen too many actions to know better. While they flailed, something else began to grow. David Foster sent me updates about the scholarship fund I had seeded in my wife's name. Applications were already trickling in. Students who wanted to study but couldn't afford tuition. Families who had scraped by just to finish high school. Young people hungry for a chance. Reading their stories, I felt something swell in me I hadn't expected. Pride, yes, but also peace. This was what money was meant for. Not to feed arrogance, but to open doors. Not to inflate egos, but to lift burdens. One evening I sat with my grandson at the kitchen table, crayons scattered across the wood as he colored in broad, messy strokes. He looked up suddenly, his eyes bright. Grandpa, Mom said you don't want to help us anymore, is that true? The question cut deeper than any voicemail. I put my hand over his small one, steadying it. I will always help you, I said gently. Always. But helping doesn't always mean giving everything away. Sometimes it means saving what matters for the right time. He nodded slowly, his young mind only half understanding but his eyes full of trust. That was enough. Meanwhile, the collapse of his parents grew harder to ignore. Their landlord finally followed through. Word spread quickly. Eviction notice posted on their door, neighbors watching as boxes were carried out, pride packed alongside possessions. My daughter avoided my gaze whenever we crossed paths in town. Her husband, though, glared openly, his pride still too stubborn to bend. But each time I walked on, silent, steady, no longer carrying the weight of their choices. Poetic justice is not about revenge, it's about balance. For years they had lived in excess built on the back of my silence. Now it was silence that stripped the excess away. And as I sat on my porch in the quiet evenings watching the sun dip low over the trees, I felt the weight shift off my shoulders piece by piece. Their collapse was not my triumph, it was my freedom. The first snow of the season had begun to fall when I realized how much had changed. I stood at the window watching flakes drift silently down, blanketing the yard, softening every edge. The world looked cleaner somehow, as if the weight of autumn had been lifted and winter had laid down its quiet truth. It felt fitting. My life, too, had shifted from storm to stillness. For months I had been consumed by the silence of abandonment. My daughter's cold text, my son-in-law's smug approval, the ache of a birthday spent alone. Those moments had carved deep scars. But now silence no longer pressed on me like a burden. It had become something else, a shield, a companion, a choice. At the kitchen table, my grandson sat coloring again, his small hands moving in confident strokes. He came more often now, dropped off for weekends when his mother needed space. I didn't question it. I welcomed every moment. "Look, Grandpa," he said proudly, holding up his page. It was a picture of a house, crooked lines but full of color. Blue roof, red door, green yard. "It's ours. Yours and mine," I smiled, my chest tightening with warmth. "It's a good house," I told him. "Strong. Safe." He beamed, returning to his work, humming softly under his breath. That simple sound, the hum of a child at peace, was worth more than all the money I had ever given away. It was worth every long night at the firehouse, every aching back, every scar on my hands. Because this, I realized, was the true legacy. Not just money in an account, but safety, trust, and love that could not be bought or stolen. Later that week, David Foster called with an update. The scholarship fund in my wife's name had received more applications than they had anticipated. Dozens of young people, each with stories of struggle, hope, and determination. "Your wife's memory," David said, "is already changing lives." I sat in my chair after the call, staring at her photograph on the mantel. Her smile seemed brighter that day, her eyes alive in a way that made the room feel less empty. "I did it," I whispered. "I kept the promise." At church on Sunday, the pastor spoke again, his sermon carrying through the still air. "Wealth is not in what we keep, but in what we give. Legacy is not about names carved in stone, but about seeds planted in soil." I sat quietly, my grandson beside me, swinging his legs against the pew. And I knew seeds had been planted. Not all wounds had healed. My daughter still avoided my gaze in town, her pride too heavy to bend into apology. Her husband walked with his head down now, his bluster muted. Their world had shrunk while mine had found its balance again. But I no longer carried anger, only clarity. That night, after my grandson had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked under his chin, I stood at the window once more, watching the snow fall in the moonlight. For years I had feared that my legacy would die with me, that everything I had worked for would be swallowed by greed and forgotten in arrogance. But I saw now that legacy is not something you leave behind. It's something you live every day, in every choice, in every silence. And I had chosen well. The fire crackled behind me, the warmth filling the room. My wife's picture looked down, steady, proud. My grandson breathed softly, safe in the quiet, and for the first time in a long time I whispered, not with grief but with peace, "This is enough." The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the world wrapped in a fragile stillness. The branches of the trees sagged under white. The road lay unmarked by tires, and the yard glittered in the pale light like glass. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the quiet settle across everything. It felt like the closing of a book. Inside, the house carried a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy silence of absence, not the painful silence of rejection, but the soft quiet of peace. My grandson's laughter still lingered from the night before, his drawings still taped crookedly to the fridge. My wife's photograph still smiled down from the mantel, her eyes steady, her memory alive. For the first time in years, I didn't dread the silence. I welcomed it. I sat down at the kitchen table with my notebook, the one I had begun during those long nights of unraveling. It was filled now, names of charities, details of the scholarship, notes about the trust. But woven between the lines were pieces of something more. Letters I had never sent. Words I had written in the dark, addressed to my daughter but never spoken aloud. I read one now, dated weeks earlier. "I loved you more than my own breath. I still do. But love is not slavery, love is not permission to be erased. One day I hope you see the difference." I closed the notebook, my fingers pressing against the worn cover. The phone buzzed suddenly, its sound sharp against the quiet. I froze. The screen lit up on the table. For a moment I thought it would be another number from the bank, or perhaps David with another update, but it wasn't. It was her. My daughter's name glowed against the glass, and below it a new message. "Dad?" Just one word. No apologies, no explanations, no demands. Just a question mark hanging in the air, waiting for me to answer. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. My thumb hovered above the screen, the silence pressing in once more. I thought of all the years of sacrifice, all the nights spent covering her mistakes, all the cruel dismissal wrapped in 12 words on my birthday. I thought of her husband's anger, his threats, his arrogance. I thought of my grandson, innocent, caught in the middle of storms he never asked for. And I thought of my wife, her voice, her wisdom, her reminder that love without respect rots, that boundaries are not cruelty but care. I set the phone down, the message still glowing. Outside, a bird landed on the snow-covered fence, its wings shaking loose the frost. It chirped once, then took off again, vanishing into the pale sky. I sipped my coffee, the warmth steady against the cold. I didn't type a reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because sometimes the final word isn't in what you say, it's in what you choose not to. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss a story like this one. And share it with someone who believes dignity and boundaries are the strongest legacy we can leave behind.